first of all, thank you guys so much for coming to the talk. Yeah, I appreciate that. And I guess I'll just start out with a little bit of my background, how I got started painting. I simply wanted some paintings for my house in 2003 and went to a gallery and you know, saw some stuff that I liked, but it was, you know, I was like, oh, this looks great. It turned out it was like an early California painting, so it was like 10,000 bucks or whatever. So I just thought, oh, well, I can do this myself, maybe. So I went to Aaron Brothers, and I got like, you know, their starter kit of Grumbacher paints, and I'm assuming, you know, some of you are painters too, so you know, but I got it like a starter kit of that, some canvas panels, and yeah, I just went home without any kind of whatever, just started painting some pictures. And it turned out it was a lot harder than I thought, so then I went to the library, got some books, and actually got a really good video. There was like a 4-part video instructional thing, which I wish I could remember what it was or who it was, because it was actually really good. It was like filmed in the 80s or whatever. So I did all of the different exercises, and it was really, that kind of got me started. And then that was the beginning, and after that I started reading in books that it was good to paint from life as much as possible. So at that time I was mostly interested in painting landscapes, so I went and I got myself a plein air setup, you know, an outdoor, something that was a portable easel that I could set up on location. And then I just exclusively painted on location for probably, I don't know, it was probably that first year, and it was really rough. I mean, most of it didn't work out. It was, so, and I would occasionally paint from photographs at night too. So that was kind of how I got started. And then, so I figured I'd also talk about this show and what's a little different about this show from, say, last year. There's a lot of similar themes in this show, like for example, obviously the cityscapes are always a favorite of mine to do those. But I feel like it's helpful to kind of shift it up and do different things, landscapes. And then this year in particular, I got into doing seascapes and ocean scenes. And part of what inspired that was just the desire to be working in front of the ocean and just being in that environment. And some of them, there's several paintings that are on the wall back here that were actually the 16 by 20s that were painted on location. And that's a real, that was a new challenge for me, because obviously the ocean is moving. So just trying to figure out the forms and how to sort of compose was a real challenge. But I really enjoyed it, and then so that's something new in this show. I think there's more ocean, although I've always been drawn to water and water scenes. But this show, I think, definitely has more of this sort of wave and ocean sort of scenes. And then the other thing that I think is different about this show is that I'm working larger. So typically when I would go plein air painting in the past, I would paint, you know, most people go out and they'll paint like a 9 by 12 or 8 by 10, these small paintings. But what I was finding is that when I was out there, it actually seemed harder in some ways to do a smaller painting and get sort of the loose, expressive feel that I'm after. So I had to get a new easel, I got this thing called an Anderson easel. I don't know if any of your artists know that. An Anderson easel is a big tripod, super stable, and you can put up to, I could paint, you know, large canvases on location, and even in a breeze, it's really stable. But I figured I'd start with 16 by 20, so I bought a couple boxes of 16 by 20s, and I just started painting those on location. And actually, there are probably, I'd say in this show, there may be 5 or 6 of those that made it into this show that were painted, the 16 by 20s that were painted on location. The funny thing is that after doing 16 by 20s for maybe, I guess it was like maybe 6 weeks, that actually started to feel small. So that was a good sign. I was like, okay, maybe I can go up to like, what, 25 by 30? But then it becomes a logistics thing. Like, how do I carry a 20, you know, a wet canvas in the car and all this stuff? But, you know, I'll work that out. So, yeah, so this shows definitely there's more larger pieces in it and more larger plein air pieces as well. And the last thing I thought I'd talk about, or the last point, is sort of my process. This year, well, my process is always sort of the same, which is I'm typically attracted to, as you can see if you look around, it's sort of, there's a variety of different subject matter. And I think that's something that keeps me excited as a painter, and something that is important for me to keep me inspired is you know, there's this scene back here of the from the Bay Bridge. That was something, I was just driving across the Bay Bridge and I was looking south and I could see the container ships and those clouds and that silvery light, and so I just popped a picture. But I thought, you know, when I saw the picture, I'm like, that's not typically what I would do, right? But that doesn't matter. So I just figure I try anything, because you never know where that experiment is going to, what path that'll open. I mean, the ocean, the seascapes were like that. It was kind of an experiment that ended up being something that was really satisfying and fun to do. So basically the process for me is pretty simple. There's that initial inspiration where I see something or see a scene that is exciting for me. And then the next thing is composition. And this is something also that this year I've really focused on and started, you know, when I first started painting, it was more just trying to get things accurate, but you know, drawing things accurate or having good brushwork. But the more I've painted, the more I realize that without, you know, if you don't have a good foundation for it, you know, in other words, if your composition isn't good, then the painting's not going to work, regardless of how well drawn it is or how fancy the brushwork is. So step one for me always is obviously the initial inspiration and then composing it. And you know, when you're plein air painting, a lot of times, I don't know if any of you plein air painted, but you usually make a quick decision about, you know, sometimes you get there and you say, okay, I'm going to go, I'm going to do this. But now I'll walk around and really take time to really carefully make sure that my composition is something that's going to work. And if I sketch it on there and it doesn't look interesting, then I'll just wipe it out and I'll start over. So that's step number one. Step number two is simply drawing. I'll sketch in just a very light sketch of what I'm going to do, not super detailed, just kind of to map out where the big shapes are. Third step would be just kind of blocking in color. What I mean is almost making like a mosaic with the paint. And you're just trying to get the canvas covered with approximations of the colors that you see. It doesn't have to be super accurate, but once you get all that paint on there, then you have some reference point to decide whether, oh, this needs to be greener or this needs to be bluer. And then the next step would be come in and refine those colors. And then the final and fifth step is usually I will set the painting aside and come back to it a few days later and see if there's anything I need to do. My goal is always to take a painting as far as I possibly can in the initial go. So I'm an alla prima painter, or, you know, that's what I like to do. I like to go for it at once and have that the painting be one experience, even a large piece. On a large piece like some of these back here, it's impossible to do it alla prima, but I can break it down into mapping it out, getting it drawn, and then putting the paint on in one go, even if it takes 8 hours. So, welcome, come on in. That's kind of the process, and I guess that was really all I was going to talk to. I'm more interested in also hearing what you guys, if you have any questions, so I could, you know, be specific. Yeah.
First of all, we all love your paintings. That's why we're here.
Thank you.
What's your palette colors? How many colors do you use? Do you have a limited palette? Broad palette?
Yeah. Okay. Good question. So yeah, palette. So what's my palette? When I first started, you know, it was recommended to work with a primary color palette so that you learn how to mix all the colors. So I did, but I used what some people call it a split primary, which would be a warm and cool of each of the primary colors. So for example, I would have like, say, you know, a cool yellow and a warm yellow, and same with the reds. Like, so the typical for reds, you'd have something like an alizarin crimson, which is a red that leans towards a purple. It's a cooler one. And then I'd have like a cad red light, which is kind of leaning towards orange, so a warm red. And then for my blues, I'd have a cerulean, which is more like almost blue-green, and then ultramarine. So the split primary is a super popular sort of palette. What I've added, you know, I've added some colors in that I use. Like I use yellow ochre now because when you're doing landscapes, it's sort of it's just a part of everything. It's a convenience. Sometimes I'll use black even, because mixed with green, with yellow can make some really good greens, dark greens. But those primaries that I was talking about, the split primary, that's always there. I always use that, and then I kind of rotate other colors. It's kind of fun to experiment with other versions of, like I just started using something called quinacridone red, which is kind of a magenta, super strong magenta. But if you mix that with, say, ultramarine, you get these very radiant purples. I even started, that became my cool red for a while. Didn't use alizarin for a while, but now I'm back to that. So I kind of shifted up a little bit. So yeah, that's my palette. Yeah.
Do you tone your canvases, and do you do any glazing as a part of your work?
Okay, yeah, so as far as toning my canvases, I do tone the canvases. Again, that's something that I do. Usually I'll use burnt sienna. Oh, the burnt sienna is on my palette as well, because I sketch in burnt sienna. And occasionally I will, when I'm on location, I will tone the canvas. And so for those of you who don't know what that is, it's just, you would take a wash, like a very loose wash of paint, and then you wipe it off. And so it would tint the canvas like with burnt sienna, it's almost like a very light orange. The nice thing when you're painting on location, though, is that if you, typically most landscapes tend to be, there's a lot of blue and green, and getting a red or getting reds into your painting can be a challenge. And yet you need those little pops of red because it makes the other colors seem radiant. So if you've toned your canvas already with a burnt sienna, then when you have the little holidays in there or the little gaps, you'll get these little pops of this sort of bright orangey red, and it's just, I don't know, it kind of increases the luminescence or the luminance or whatever. It gives for that, you know, really creates that light feel. So I do, but occasionally I don't, because I may want a super clean sky, or I may want to use the canvas, the white of the canvas, to come through, and I don't want to muddy that at all. So it just depends on the subject, and just, I don't know, like kind of whim, just like, oh, I think I'll tone it, or maybe I won't. So that's another thing that's kind of weird, is like painting all these different sizes and all these different subjects. I don't get into any like specific like real groove, you know, which can be good and bad. I feel it's good because it keeps me on my toes. I don't ever want to get so like, I don't want to get slick. I want it to still look like a person painted it, you know what I mean? I don't want it to be so, I just want that human feel in there. And I feel like, you know, by shifting it up and everything, I'm still able to get, you know, results that I'm happy with or satisfied with, but I don't feel like I feel like I still have to work for it, you know, it's, you know, I'll say it's a struggle every time almost, you know, it's always a struggle, but a good one, a good struggle. Anyway, any other questions? Yeah.
Running on the idea of toning the canvas with burnt sienna, if it's not dry,
yeah.
First of all, are you just using the spirits?
Yeah, so what do
you go with the spirits so they dry quickly? Yeah,
actually, okay, so that's a good question. So when I tone the canvas, I will use odorless mineral spirits, which is that's the modern version of turpentine. It's like not as volatile, and it's, you know, so I'll use that, a wash of that with the burnt sienna. Now, when you wipe it down, the canvas is still damp. The nice thing for you painters out there, the nice thing about that is that when you actually go to apply the paint, it goes on really nicely. Whereas if you're trying to put paint onto a dry canvas, you know, you might have to work it or scrub it. It's kind of, but when you've got that like film of tone on there, the odorless mineral spirits, then it kind of just, you know, when the brush hits it, it just takes the paint beautifully. So it's kind of something, if you're painting fast and you're painting on location, you can get the paint onto the canvas a lot quicker and it looks more spontaneous. So actually having it damp like that is a good thing. Yeah. Any other questions here?
Do you use medium or do you use paint right out of the tube after mixing it?
Yeah, so as far as mediums, when I paint on location, I'll a lot of times use Liquin, which I don't know if any of you know what Liquin is. Liquin's a fast drying medium by Winsor & Newton. It smells super toxic, so I don't like to use it. It is, it's like, I used it once inside, I was like, oh my God, never again. But so mediums thin the paint so that they can be applied easier for those of you who are maybe not artists. And so I'll use Liquin on location. The good thing about that is it dries in 24 hours as well, so it dries really quickly. I like the way the paint goes down with it too. It's a little, it speeds up the covering process and the strokes can look really fluid and everything. When I'm indoors, sometimes I won't use medium at all. I'll just thin the paint a little bit with the odorless mineral spirits. But occasionally I'll also use a mixture of linseed oil and stand oil. Stand oil is a thickened linseed oil. And so when I'm painting on panels, I tend to use that because it's kind of, each surface behaves a little different, so I'll adjust the mediums for what surface I'm painting on. So if I'm painting on a hard surface like a panel, like the little cityscapes, I'll use medium for those. But some of these bigger ones, I didn't use medium at all. I just used thin to paint a little bit, and it's all pretty much just, you know, straight paint. Yeah. Jen?
So, changing topic. What can you tell us about the sailing piece, which is so, yeah, it really stands out as different.
Yeah, okay, so, right.
What's the story there?
Okay, so the sailing piece, so the story on that was, I have like my stuff on Instagram, and I had this woman who, she wanted to come in for a studio visit. She came by for a studio visit. She bought a few small pieces. And then about 6 months later, she said, I'd really like to commission you to do a sailing painting. And I said, and I was actually a sailing teacher for 7 years, like taught sailing on you know, boats, larger boats and stuff. So sailing was something, and I grew up, when I moved from New Jersey when I was in 8th grade, and we moved to Foster City, and so we sailed boats and stuff like that. So I have sort of a background of that, but she wanted the sailing painting. And so I did a bunch of sketches back and forth, and she wanted kind of a traditional one for and she wanted it big. It was 3 feet by 5 feet. So I did a bunch, and this one was one of the sketches that I did for her. And I really liked it. I really liked the water in this, and I don't know, there was just something cool. And so to me, even though it's really different, like I wouldn't have done it if it hadn't been for that project. But once it was done, I was like, oh, I want that over my fireplace. It makes me feel like I'm in New England or something, you know, whatever. So that's how that came about. So it is, I know it's a little different. It's a little different. Anyway, yeah, Vincent?
I noticed that in all your paintings you have very few people.
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah.
Is that by design, or do you choose not to because you don't want them to clutter up the vision?
Well, you know, it's interesting as far as like, okay, so having people in my paintings, yeah. No, you know, there was one year here where I did have quite a few, you know, and like where it just, again, it depends, like I'll get in a groove. Like there was that year I did a whole bunch of, these like sort of crosswalk series, you know, like there was a bunch of people in crosswalks and everything, and that was really fun. I suppose, and then, you know, I was like the surfer, and then the guy coming out of the ocean. It's more, you know, I think if there's an idea or something that comes to me where there's a person involved in it, or I take a picture that inspires me, then I will paint it. But that is something I'd like to do more of. You know, I'd like to have more, you know, maybe next year I'll do more crosswalk paintings or something else. You never know. Yeah. So anyway, there was other, oh, back at it. Oh. Yeah.
I'm so curious that you started at 0 14 years ago. Is it possible to describe what your paintings looked like 14 years ago?
Oh, I wish I had brought one. Yeah, yeah. Okay, yeah, no, I could totally.
On the web.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, there's none on the web, but I will. So, yeah, so I'm doing this for the video. The question is what my paintings look like in the beginning and how they evolved, right? So, in the beginning, actually, it's funny because my mom has the very first painting I did. And so, but it was buried away for a long time. But I was just down there, and it was like up on the mantelpiece, and I'm like, what's that thing doing out? But that first painting took me, it was super detailed, and it was like really, like I painted every blade of grass, and there was like a cottage out by the ocean, and it was super detailed. It wasn't that bad, but it's just so far from what I've done now. It was just like, and I remember it took me like, I think there was like 4 6-hour sessions. Yeah, it was a long time. So, and then my first plein air paintings, that was when there was another change. And those first plein air paintings were just, I was just overwhelmed. They were muddy and awful, you know, and I didn't have any idea of composition, and it's hard to describe, but occasionally I'd get one that would work out, and that kept me motivated and kept me going. So, you know, so there was just enough good there to keep me going, but there was a lot of bad. The other thing I'll say about this too is that the biggest shift that's happened, like over time, is I still do paintings that I'm not satisfied with. The bar keeps raising, right? So it keeps going up. So you never get to the point where you're like, oh, I got this, you know? Because you always want to do more. You always want to do better. And so the thing that's changed, though, that I think is healthier now is that when I fail, or when something doesn't meet my expectations, and if I go out and I do, like, say, I just recently, even that summer, I went out and I did like 9 paintings in a row that were just like, what is up? Do I even know what I'm doing anymore? But I don't so much question that. I don't say, okay, I don't have the ability or whatever. Whereas when you're starting, if you have a few bad paintings in your row, you're like, am I wasting my time? And I went through that time after time, where I'd say, what am I even doing, you know? The thing is, you realize as the longer you do it, that that's a normal and healthy part of the process. The healthy way to handle that is to say, which is what I try to do now, is like, this didn't work out. I go home, I look at paintings, I look at my painting, and I go, what happened? Like, how can I make this work? So that's the shift. But anyway, the paintings were not so good. Yeah, they
okay,
weren't.
So I'm going to pipe in here.
Yeah.
Because last week was the 10-year anniversary that we've been showing your work.
Oh yeah.
And
Yeah.
I will admit, I think Rob would own up to this too, that when we started, we didn't particularly know what we were doing very much either. But we did love your paintings. And your first paintings that we had in the gallery were a series of like taco trucks.
Yeah, right.
San Mateo.
Right.
And they were really simple, but very heartfelt and lovely.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And I don't think they're online because we have a new website now. But
Lifeguard jacks too.
Say it again?
The lifeguard.
Oh, there was lifeguard jacks,
and
yeah.
who was in here yesterday? He said, oh, we have the lifeguard shack.
Yeah.
I was like, oh my God, that really amazing.
Wow, yeah.
We celebrated it for the first few years, and we just got stuck with you.
We did, yeah.
Yeah.
So, I mean, you know.
Yeah, well, you know, that's the thing that's really interesting, and for you, those of you who are artists, the hardest thing is that, you know, you look at yourself as like, you know, we can be so critical, but there's an element that you would see that I wouldn't see, which is hopefully the personality of the painter, right? And so that's why I think that's something that's always been important to me, is what you're talking about, is painting things that genuinely like move me or you know, to try to just figure out who I am as a painter and as a creator, and have it be personal. I mean, in as much as, you know, you're just, you know, so anyway, it's interesting that showed through in the beginning. And I think that thread has, in other words, my paintings have developed, certainly in my ability to create them. But I think that the vision is still me in a way, you know? So I'm better maybe able to express that, but maybe it was there all along. Yeah, so that's an interesting point. But anyway, you had a question too.
Yes, and to change the subject, could you talk more about how you decide what to paint? You know, if you go out plein air, what's grabbing you or giving you that moment when you say, oh, I have to paint this?
Yeah.
I don't know if you can put that into words or not. But
yeah.
how do you choose your subject and frame your composition?
Yeah, you know, that's interesting. So yeah, how do I choose my subject and frame the composition? I would say when I'm on location, so usually what I'll take is I'll take a viewfinder, which is something that restricts the view. It's sort of like a little square and you can move it around and you can kind of compose with that. And the nice thing about that is that as I'm looking, there will be a moment where something happens where I'm like, and it's almost instantaneous, like, it's like, oh, there it is, go. And then I just go. And now if it's like with a photograph, like on the computer, I have to have that same experience. So what I'll do is I'll take, like, say, I have a bunch of images on my computer, and then if I'm scrolling through and I see something that catches my eye, well, then I'll crop it, and I'll experiment cropping until I have that moment where there it is, it's go time, you know? It's like, so there is this little, like, there has to be that little spark or that little click of like, I want to paint this. Mm-hmm. You know, I don't ever want to get to the point where I'm like, I don't want to paint this, but I'm going to. There always has to be that little spark of like, okay, I can do this, this will work, this is cool, that little excitement, right? I used to, when I'd paint on location, I wouldn't do that, and that's a mistake, because I would just be like, oh, I gotta go, I gotta get going, you know, the light's changing. But no, now I always wait for that little, so it's kind of like this little feeling of excitement or inspiration, maybe you'd call it, just like something where I feel like, okay, I could do this, this will work, or at least it's worth a try, right? So anyway, I know there's another question here too.
Can I add something to that?
Oh yeah.
Because you told me about a month ago you like painting next to the surf.
Yeah.
The energy of the surf helps the energy of the painting. I think maybe it was Andrew Zorn or something that you read that in. And if you just talk about how that affects the painting when you're choosing a subject.
Oh yeah.
Location.
Okay, yeah. So yeah, I talked about painting near the surf. This was something that I thought, okay, you have a couple choices. Say if you're going to paint, you know, some people would say, well, if you're going to paint the ocean, why not paint from a photograph, because obviously it doesn't move and you can compose it perfectly or whatever. The thing that I found that Rab's speaking about, when I was out in front of the ocean and I was standing there, I'd go out to Montera Light, and I don't know if you guys know where that is, beautiful spot, but I could kind of walk down on the rocks and set up and stand there. And this is something you'd never get from a photograph. As the water's moving and swirling, there's like, the colors are incredible. Like there's all these like blue greens, and there's this energy, and there's this smell and all this stuff. And what ends up happening is when you're trying to paint that and capture that, you're standing in front of your easel with these pigments and you realize the incredible limitations you have to try to convey this moving, beautiful, powerful thing, right? But what I think that actually does is that it inspires you out of frustration almost. Like you're painting, you're like, where's the life in this or whatever. I think it can really inspire you to experiment and push and try to get some kind of vitality in there because you're faced with that vitality and you're in front of it. Whereas if you were on a computer, you wouldn't have that experience. So that's another thing about standing in front of the ocean and painting is frustrating, or nature in general. It's just more inspiring and stimulating and frustrating, but that frustration can push you to do things you might not otherwise do, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Which paintings?
Which artists, right?
Painters inspired you?
Right. So, okay, which painters inspired me? Yeah. So, like I said, yeah, I would go to Cape Cod every summer as a kid, and so I think some of those Edward Hopper paintings early on, they seemed familiar in a way, but as you notice in these paintings too, hopefully anyway, most of them, there's, I always am going for a strong feeling of light. And light is something that, for me, is kind of, is crucial to have a believable feeling of light in the paintings. And that's something I definitely got from Hopper. Later, I was sort of inspired by early California painters just because I'm here and I wanted to see how other artists kind of handled this environment in this area. So early California people like E. Charlton Fortune, I don't know if you know her, she was a painter back in Monterey. Great colors and light in her paintings. And also, I don't know, Guy Rose, and I mean kind of all of them. I didn't really have any particular favorite, just kind of, you know, see, all of them had a few paintings that I liked. And then contemporary painters, I don't really, that's kind of a hard one. Like, it's interesting. I don't have any one specific because I see paintings by a lot of different people that inspire me. And I mean, you got, you know, Brian Estel back here as a painter. He's inspired me, honestly. Mercedes, she's done some great stuff that inspires me. I find inspiration in, you know, Inga too, yeah. I mean, everybody does stuff that inspires me. You just never know when. But it's not like just, say, specific big painters. Ben Aronson, I remember when I started doing cityscapes, Ben Aronson was one. I got to remember that. He definitely was. Yeah, I hope that answers the question. But I'm just open to looking at a lot of stuff. Although I will say now, like at this point, there was a time where I felt like I was a big fan of Tim Horn's work too. I still am, and Tim's a friend, and I love his work. And he has great light. So when I first started, he was a huge inspiration.
Is that Tim Horn? Tim
Horn, yeah, he's up in Marin. There's other painters too. Colin Page is somebody that's inspired me too. He's back east, and I've seen his work in galleries. He's inspired me just because he paints large, and I like his art spirit. He's got a good art spirit, very fluid brushwork, and so sometimes a painter will inspire me almost as much because of their work ethic and their spirit. I find that as inspiring often as the work itself. So anyway. Any other? Oh, yeah.
What do you do with the paintings which you don't like, or they didn't come out the way you would like them to come out?
Okay, yeah. So what do I do with the paintings that don't work out? What I do is occasionally I will sand them down. If you turn around, there's a cityscape right behind you, like with the one right to the right over there. The little, there's yeah, that one right there. Yeah, there you go.
This one?
Yes, that was a painting that didn't work, and I sanded it down, and then I painted over it, painted over the panel. Oh yeah, here we go.
So don't drop.
Yeah, so yeah, this one, this was, and I paint them on panels that I make out of masonite, and I just gesso them. But this painting was one, and I don't even remember, it's gone, I don't remember what was on there, but I sanded it down, and actually the surface is really nice because it's got that oil base on it, but it was all different colors everywhere, right? I may have even turned it upside down so that I didn't see what it was before. And then I just painted over it. And a lot of times painting over an old painting, even though it's really unsettling because you're dealing with that other image that's under there, this is like, I really like this painting. I really like the way it came out. Is that okay for me to say? But anyway, but I often really do appreciate like the fact that the old painting, little bits of color here and there come through. And so that's one thing I do with them. Occasionally though, I'll hang on to them and see if I can rework them sometimes too. Occasionally that'll happen, like I'll get stumped on a painting, and then, you know, a year will go by and I'll pull it out and I'll go, oh, I can solve that problem now, whereas at the time I couldn't. So, but I still do have boxes, you know. That's why I paint on panels, because they take up less space, you know, at least initially, you know. So now my success rate's a little better, but yeah, you know, there's still those ones in boxes for sure. Yeah. Any other questions, Vincent?
Well, you know, you said you actually started painting, if you want to say professionally, in 2003. 2003, I think you said?
I think I started painting, period. I didn't have any previous experience at all. So in 2003, I was 38 years old and just on a whim started painting. But I think I sold my first painting to like a friend like a year later. I sell them to friends like for a year later, but I didn't start showing in a gap. I had some I started selling online maybe in 2006, little paintings. Those were my first sales. First gallery was studio in 2007, yeah.
But were you always artistic? Were you always good at drawing as a younger person? Or?
Yeah, so as a young person, like that's kind of interesting. I drew like I think most kids like to draw, you know, so I drew as a kid, but I don't think I was particularly exceptional. I mean, I did it and enjoyed it, but I was always somebody who I would say, my mom would always say, oh, you're such a creative kid, you know, because I would like take her like those springy hair curler things, you know, and make things out of the springs, and I'd make things out of like, I was always making stuff, you know, so it's kind of more surprising that I didn't turn out to be like something like Jerry Barish or something, like making like random things. It's never too late, it could happen. And I was kind of always like, yeah, making things, but the thing about painting is it satisfied the same sort of urge without filling my house with junk. You know, like if you're making stuff constantly, it's harder to store that stuff, you know? But I still do scratch that itch because I build all of these frames. I make all of them. And that's kind of a thing it's a different kind of creative thing, and I really enjoy that. It's like nice to kind of take a break and work on building frames. So I guess I've always been sort of crafty. And it doesn't really matter. Like, it's so funny because, you know, I just remember even making like anything. If somebody was doing something creative, I get involved. Like, I remember one time, like, I think when my daughter was little, like making dolls, you know, out of just raw materials and stuff. And I like totally got into that. So it doesn't really matter, you know, it's like, anyway, so hope that answers the question.
Being a musician, does that help your artwork? Does it give you confidence that you can figure out a song, you can figure out painting? Or?
That's a good point. Yeah, so before I did this, like when I was in my 20s, and I always played guitar and sang and stuff, and like when I was about 19, 20, I moved to the city and I was like, got in bands and we'd write songs and record them and stuff like that. So I did, all through my 20s, I played in bands. And like Rab said, you know, it was the same thing. I taught most kids you learn from listening to records, you know, and you just sort of, the peer pressure, you're trying to outdo your friend or whatever. So we all learned, you know, how to play just by ear and whatever. But the process of becoming a musician did absolutely, when I was older and I decided to paint, I felt like I'd already been through that self-educating process, so I had faith in it. The one thing though, this idea that you can't teach old dogs new tricks is total BS. The difference, it's total BS. The difference, and I thought of that, I was like, okay, well what's the difference? And I remember even before I started painting, before it even popped into my head, having this conversation with my dad about it, and you know, he and his wife were saying, you know, that you know, by a certain age, you pretty much know whatever. And I was like, no, you never know. You never know, you know? And the thing that's different that kids have is they have time and attention, right? So, like, as adults, the challenge we have is just we have so much going on. So you can't, and you like, and I went through that when I started painting, and I'd go out and I'd be driving around, especially early on, and I might get skunked, and I'd be like, go out to like paint, and I wouldn't find anything, and everybody's working, what am I doing, you know? Like I felt guilty, you know, like what am I doing here? As you're a kid, you don't care. You don't have that sort of thing hovering over you. So I think that's, yeah, as far as old dogs, new tricks, whatever, it's just more the time and the ability to focus on something. If you have that, you can do it, you know, absolutely. Yeah?
How do you balance personal life with work?
Personal life with work, right. That's a good question. That balance is, you know, that's just, it's almost kind of like this, The one nice thing about working as a, you know, for yourself or being a painter or whatever is that I can paint frames at 1 in the morning, or I can do it whenever. And so if an opportunity comes to go be social and hang out with a friend, I could do that. Or if my daughter needs me for something, I can take off the day and I can do that. So in some ways, it's a lot easier because I have complete flexibility, but I never stop working. So I'm always working every day, 7 days a week. But it's what I want to do anyway, you know, so then I feel like if I'm ahead, then if I need to take off a couple days because something comes up, I can do that. And I'm still getting better at that because, you know, life changes and different situations arise, and so it's always, you know, there's times when it's a struggle and times when it seems like, oh, this is great, you know. So yeah. Any other questions?
Oh, tell everybody about all of your social media stuff.
Oh, okay, yeah, so, well, right, well, I have, yeah, I mean, if you ever want to see I made videos of my painting processes and everything, so if you go on YouTube, it's Chamberlain Paintings on YouTube, it's my channel, and there's some different like plein air adventures where I go out and paint on location, or I'll do like a studio demo. And then if you're on Instagram, it's same thing, Chamberlain Paintings on Instagram, so. Anyway, thank you guys so much for coming, and I really appreciate it. Yeah.